he took a course that had been taught at Harvard longer than any other in the history of the university, Plants and Human Affairs. And the iconoclastic Professor Oakes Ames, who hated the federal government and had insisted throughout all of Prohibition that his students brew and distill and ferment copious amounts of booze as a laboratory experiment, had his limits when it came time to these plants that we now call the hallucinogens. And so the students had to do a book report, and Schultes had so much other homework that he rushed to the back of the room, plucked from the shelf the thinnest volume he could find, put it in his satchel, and returned to his tenement in East Boston. And that night, when he drew that volume out of his book bag, history was made. Because that book turned out to be the only monograph then available in the English language that described the stunning pharmacological effects of peyote, of mescaline. And throughout the night, this very conservative lad from East Boston read of visions of orb-like brilliance that descended from the heavens over the consciousness of the consumer. He went back to Professor Ames the next day and he said, "I must know this plant." And Ames said, "You can study it for your thesis. I might even be able to get you a grant." Of course, the grant came from Professor Ames' own pocket. And that's how Schultes began to study peyote. Now, he read of the plant before he headed off into the field. He knew that the plant had originated in the Sierra Madre Occidental with the Tarahumara and the Huichol. And he knew that it had reached the Great Plains through this extraordinary moment of societal and cultural collapse. It was not an original practice in the American plains. In fact, it came into the plains in the wake of the collapse of the Great Plains cultures as a kind of pharmacological shortcut to the distant metaphysical realms that have been traditionally reached by the sun dance and by the pain of initiation, of ordeal and of isolation in the vision quest. And it reached into the plains from the Huichol through the hands of a Comanche by the name of Quanah Parker, who had been wounded in battle and had a vision in his delirium of a sacred plant. And it was from the Kiowa that this plant would disperse to almost every culture in North America, the highest rate of diffusion of any major sort of religious artifact in the history of anthropology. And of course, this is a world that had collapsed within a generation, a century perhaps, of its birth. In 1871, buffalo still outnumbered people in North America. Within 7 years, they were a shadow in the prairie. And when the last of the Great Plains cultures was reduced to the reservations, Philip Sheridan, who had orchestrated that campaign, suggested to the U.S. Congress that a commemorative medal be minted that would have on the one side of it a dead buffalo and on the other side of it a dead Indian. This was explicit policy, of course, of the U.S. cavalry to deny the Indian people their commissary. But Schultes, in 1928, having never been west of the Charles River, got into this beat-up old 1928 Studebaker and bumped and rumbled west to Oklahoma Territory, where he lived with the Kiowa, and 5 days a week, for 8 influential weeks of his young life, he ate peyote. He was the last generation of scholars to know the peoples who had actually known the cultures of the plains. People like Mary Buffalo, Hepa Bears, Charlie Charcoal. And he realized that this sacrament was somehow essential to the well-being, and that the key to the cultural survival of the people was their ability to take this journey to the divine. And this, as I say, he did every second night for that long, wonderful summer. And you would never know from this photograph, in which he has apparently not even loosened the red Harvard tie around his neck, that he has just come out of a peyote ceremony that has sent a dozen Kiowa on a collective journey to their gods. The Kiowa were an amazing people, incidentally. They were the individual tribe that killed more white people per capita than any other. They owned more horses than any other. Every year they would come together when the cottonwood seed set for the sun dance, and they would put the teepees in a horseshoe to the rising sun. The Taime symbol, the fetish symbol of the sun, would then be unveiled with the essence of the buffalo within it. And there was always one warrior who stood at the opening of the encirclement of teepees, following the sun day and night with his vision, literally allowing himself to be driven blind so that metaphorically the people in the coming year would learn how to see. So Schultes came back to Harvard a different person, and he testified that summer of 36 on Congress with Kroeber, saying that this was a plant that was absolutely legitimate part of the traditional practice. Pretty heady stuff for a kid from the tenements of East Boston. And while he was in Washington working on his undergraduate thesis, he stumbled on the clue that allowed him to solve the greatest mystery in the history of ethnobotany.